Hello, folks. A lot of information in this area, a lot of videos, so you might want to take some time to actually watch the videos on your own because I do play them a little bit faster on my lecture, but I also wanted the opportunity to talk to you a little bit about this idea because one of the big ways in which we create a big system of us versus them is through classism. I think unless you're rich, it's pretty easy to notice classism because you really start to get a sense of like who gets favored with classism and who doesn't get favored with classism. So getting into this material, I think, will help us a lot. A lot of course competencies we will end up talking about or getting a sense of what it is and how it works. But let's go ahead and jump into one of the videos about understanding classism and how classism works. Again, I'm going to say when you watch this, do watch this online because the visuals are striking, and I feel like it really helps you understand some of the issues and problems.
I saw recently that I can't get out of my head. A Harvard business professor in Commons asked more than 5,000 Americans. There's a chart. They took home only 9%. Asked more than 5,000 Americans how they thought wealth was distributed in the United States. This is what they said about us. Divided the country into 5 rough groups, the top, bottom, and middle 3 20% groups. They asked people how they thought the wealth in this country was divided. Then he asked them what they thought was the ideal distribution. And 92%, that's at least 9 out of 10 of them, said it should be more like this. In other words, more equitable than they think it is. Now that fact is telling, admittedly. The notion that most Americans know that the system is already skewed unfairly. But what's most interesting to me is the reality compared to our perception. The ideal is as far removed from our perception of reality as the actual distribution is from what we think exists in this country. So ignore the ideal for a moment. Here's what we think it is again. And here is the actual distribution. Shockingly skewed. Not only do the bottom 20% and the next 20%, the bottom 40% of Americans barely have any wealth. I mean, it's hard to even see them on the chart. But the top 1% has more of the country's wealth than 9 out of 10 Americans believe the entire top 20% should have. Mind-blowing. But let's look at it another way, because I find this chart kind of difficult to wrap my head around. Instead, let's reduce the 311 million Americans to just a representative 100 people. Make it simple. Here they are. Teachers, coaches, firefighters, construction workers, engineers, doctors, lawyers, some investment bankers, a CEO, maybe a celebrity or two. Now let's line them up according to their wealth. Poorest people on the left, wealthiest on the right, just a steady row of folks based on their net worth. We'll color code them like they did before based on which 20% quintile they fall into. Now, let's reduce the total wealth of the United States, which was roughly $54 trillion in 2009, to this symbolic pile of cash. And let's distribute it among our 100 Americans. Well, here's socialism, all the wealth of the country distributed equally. We all know that won't work. You need to encourage people to work hard, to achieve that good old American dream and keep our country moving forward. So, here's that ideal we asked everyone about. Something like this curve. This isn't too bad. We've got some incentive, as the wealthiest folks are now about 10 to 20 times better off than the poorest Americans. But hey, even the poor folks aren't actually poor, since the poverty line stayed almost entirely off the chart. We have a super healthy middle class with a smooth transition into wealth. And yes, Republicans and Democrats alike chose this curve. 9 out of 10 people, 92%, said this was a nice, ideal distribution of America's wealth. But let's move on. This is what people think America's wealth distribution actually looks like. Not as equitable, clearly, but for me, even this still looks pretty great. Yes, the poorest 20 to 30% are starting to suffer quite a lot compared to the ideal, and the middle class is certainly struggling more than they were, while the rich and wealthy are making roughly 100 times that of the poorest Americans, and about 10 times that of the still healthy middle class. Sadly, this isn't even close to reality. Here's the actual distribution of wealth in America. The poorest Americans don't even register. They're down to pocket change, and the middle class is barely distinguishable from the poor. In fact, even the rich between the top 10 and 20 percentile are worse off. Only the top 10% are better off. And how much better off? So much better off that the top 2 to 5% are actually off the chart at this scale. And the top 1%, this guy, well, his stack of money stretches 10 times higher than we can show. Here's his stack of cash, restacked, all by itself. This is the top 1% we've been hearing so much about. So much green in his pockets that I have to give him a whole new column of his own, because he won't fit on my chart. 1% of America has 40% of all the nation's wealth. The bottom 8%, 8 out of every 10 people, or 80 out of these 100, only has 7% between them. And this has only gotten worse in the last 20 or 30 years. While the richest 1% take home almost a quarter of their national income today, in 1976, they took home only 9%, meaning their share of income has nearly tripled in the last 30 years. The top 1% own half the country's stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. The bottom 50% of Americans own only 0.5% of these investments, which means they aren't investing. They're just scraping by. I'm sure many of these wealthy people have worked very hard for their money. But do you really believe that the CEO is working 380 times harder than his average employee? Not his lowest paid employee, not the janitor, but
but the average earner is not. An average worker needs to work more than a month to earn what the CEO makes in 1 hour. We certainly don't have to go all the way to socialism to find something that is fair for hardworking Americans. We don't even have to achieve what most of us consider might be ideal. All we need to do is wake up and realize that the reality in this country is not at all what we think it is.
So again, that is a great visual to get a sense of what wealth inequality looks like. And when you see it, when you see what it looks like, it's staggering to realize exactly how bad it is. But part of the reason why it's as bad as it is because it is actually more expensive to be poor. I'm sure you're like, what? More expensive to be poor? That is the truth. Let's check that out.
Most people are not super wealthy, but we all have an idea of what it might be like to be a wealthy person. We watch them on TV, we follow them on Instagram, we read their blogs and autobiographies. Unfortunately, that awareness of how the other practices doesn't happen much in the population. When many of us have probably described ourselves as broke or poor at one point or another, very few have an understanding of what real poverty feels like.
And it's not just a matter of having less money. Once you get below a certain threshold, a whole new set of rules apply that actually make day-to-day life more expensive. If you've never struggled with real poverty, you might not be aware of the many hidden costs and financial traps that conspire to keep poor people poor.
It's very hard to make your way through modern life without access to basic financial services like checking accounts, ATMs, and personal checks. But the less money you have, the more these things will cost you. That's because banks make their profit by accruing interest on your loans. So if your account balance is too low, usually under $1,500, they won't consider you a helpful client anymore, and they'll make you pay for the basic services in the form of a monthly fee.
And heaven help you if you go below zero. Each overdraft incurs a charge of about $35, and many banks will deliberately reorder your transactions for the day, the biggest to smallest, to drive you into the red more quickly and rack up as many overdraft payments as possible.
If a bank is willing to extend your credit at all, the terms will be much less favorable for someone with a rosier financial history. You'll pay more money in interest and you'll be late and fees, more penalties and fees.
Even cash can be more expensive if you don't have much of it. If you withdraw $100 from an out-of-network ATM, that $3 fee equates to a 3% service charge. But if you can only afford to take out $20 at a time, you're essentially paying a 15% charge to access your own money.
Taken together, this means that a poor person might end up paying $100,000 or $1,000 a year for services that wealthier people virtually enjoy for free. It's no wonder then that a lot of wealthy people avoid loans altogether. But even that comes as a steep price. Cash in a paycheck without a bank account costs money. Buying a money order, pay your electric bill costs money. And if that bill is due just a couple days, well, you can either get hit with a late fee or a FedEx it. Extra expense that someone with a debit card and an internet connection never has to worry about.
If you think that dealing with credit card debt is bad, then you're lucky stars who've never dealt with a payday or car title lender. These businesses are often the only recourse for people without credit cards, and their interest rates reach upwards of 800% annually.
Not only does it cost more to borrow and spend money, but what you spend on is often more expensive. If you have to be a family on a tight budget, buying in bulk at supermarkets is usually the best option. Not available when even if they had the cash on hand to buy a week's worth of food in one trip, how is someone who depends on public transportation supposed to get it home? On their lap in the bus?
Big food retailers, ones with enough purchasing power to offer low prices, are notorious for avoiding poor neighborhoods, and people who live in these so-called food deserts often lack the mobility to cruise around town bargain hunting. Instead, they're stuck with local convenience and corner stores whose prices are much higher. Or they rely on fast food, which can seem cheap in comparison, but is actually more expensive than cooking at home, to say nothing of the long-term health risks.
Rent can also be more expensive. Most landlords require a security deposit fee of $500,000 to move in, an impossible sum for people barely scraping by. In that case, your only option other than homelessness might be a low-end extended stay hotel, which typically don't require deposits, but cost way more than an apartment in the long run. And they often lack amenities like kitchen appliances and laundry that save apartment dwellers time and money.
They say time is money, and the less money you have, the more time you have to spend on everyday tasks. Waiting at the bus stop, waiting at the laundromat, waiting at overcrowded clinics and public offices. This leaves much less free time to take care of one's family, pick up extra work, or strategize a way out of poverty.
It gets worse. Inflation, the general increase in prices, tends to hit things like food, gas, and rent the hardest. The lower your income, the greater percentage of it goes to these costs. So a poor person will see their year-over-year expenses go up at a higher rate than a wealthy person.
All these pressures take a toll on one's psyche that only makes things worse. Imagine having to constantly make tough decisions about where to spend your last few dollars. Pay the water bill or buy food for dinner. Put gas in the car or see a doctor. This relentless burning of mental energy leads to a deterioration in the quality of one's judgment, a phenomenon psychologists call decision fatigue. It's why someone might visit a payday lender when they know it's a bad idea. They're so exhausted that they'll settle for a quick fix, even if it will lead to more problems down the road.
Closely related to decision fatigue is the scarcity trap, which is our tendency to fixate on the resources that we have the least of, to the point that we lose sight of the big picture. Running low on diapers, for instance, can create a feeling of panic that compels a poor mother to buy 6 months worth of puppies, only to realize afterwards that she didn't set aside enough money for rent.
Some might think that poor people just need to work harder and spend smarter, While it's true that improving your financial situation requires these things, it also requires having at least a little bit of extra cash to move around and access to decent spending options.
If you can't choose where you shop, where you live, or where you bank, you become a captive customer to predatory businesses. If you don't have any extra money to save or invest or budget, you can't make a financial plan. And what are you supposed to think about tomorrow when you're constantly putting out today's fires?
Next time you describe yourself as broke, remember that having just a little bit of wiggle room is infinitely better than having none at all. It can make all the difference if you're trying to improve your financial situation.
So if you do have that wiggle room, be thankful and don't waste it.
And that's our 2 cents. Missing one payment can quickly spiral into a pit of debt. Has this ever happened to you? And were you able to escape it? Share your story in the comments.
So again, when we look at that, that's kind of shocking, right? Like that it's actually more expensive to be poor. But it makes sense because financial institutions weren't built to serve poor people. They were built to serve people with a certain amount of money in their bank account. And so it's hard because this system tends to favor those that are doing better. And it's what's weird is the better that we are doing, the more like rich we feel, the less connected to others we can feel. So again, I'm going to show you a video that I accidentally skipped over that talks to how do we tend to act if we feel rich, and then how do we tend to act if we feel poor.
In California, you're supposed to stop for a pedestrian at a crosswalk. And in a recent study, about 90% of drivers did, except for those driving luxury cars, like this BMW. They were almost as likely to run the intersection as wait for the person to cross the street. Drivers of those BMWs, those Porsches, those Mercedes were anywhere from 3 to 4 times more likely to break the law than drivers of less expensive, low-status cars. In a country more and more polarized by inequality, UCal Berkeley's Paul Pitt led a series of startling studies showing an apparent link between wealth and, well, unseemly behavior.
Oh, by the way, this candy there is actually for children for another study, but you're welcome to take these if you want to.
That's the script an experimenter recited to every subject. And the results? Wealthier participants took 2 times as much candy from children as did poor participants. Another experiment tested honesty in reporting dice scores when cash was on the line. People all the way at the top who made $150,000, $200,000 a year were actually cheating 4 times as much as someone all the way at the bottom who made under $15,000 a year just to win credits for a $50 cash prize. So, experimental evidence that rich people are more likely to break the law while driving, help themselves to candy meant for children, cheat in a game of chance. Also, to lie during negotiations and endorse unethical behavior, including stealing at work. The academic papers resulting made headlines everywhere. The Wall Street Journal article leading with the question, ready to pitchforks?
It is very clear that this study of such a class touched her nerves.
Psychology professor Dacher Keltner is Paul Pitt's boss and co-author.
We publish these studies in relatively obscure scientific journals, and literally the next day we're getting hundreds of emails from around the world, and a lot quite hostile. I've gotten a lot of vitriol and hate mail from people calling me out for junk science and having a liberal agenda.
Hey, wait. Didn't those who complained have a point? That the research was done at a famously, some might say infamously, liberal university.
Hey, you're in Berkeley. What other results do you expect to get? I regularly hear the Berkeley idiot scientists who's finding what they expect to find. Let me tell you, we did not expect to find this. Our findings apply to both liberals and conservatives. It doesn't matter who you are. If you're wealthy, you're more likely to show these patterns of results.
Results consistent across 30 studies he's run on thousands of people all over the United States. So what is it about wealth that might make people behave differently?
What are we doing here? We're playing a game of Monopoly that's rigged.
This game is typical of another kind of experiment Pitt likes to run. Instead of studying actual rich people, Pitt gets subjects to feel rich in the lab. The designated Monopoly money bags starts with a few legs up. $2,000 versus the poor man's $1,000. An upscale playing piece, the rolls, versus an old shoe. The right to toss 2 dice instead of just 1. 2, I get snake eyes on, meaning I assign the roll of rich person, get an extra turn. So when I roll again, because I've got, because you rolled doubles. 6, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and that's Tennessee Avenue, of course I'll buy that. Meanwhile, poor Paul Pitt.
I only get to roll 1 die, and as it says here, when I pass go, I collect a lower salary. I collect $100. Here's 1 die. Great, thanks so much. I can't roll doubles, and don't get opportunities to move very far along the board.
Pitt has run this experiment with hundreds of people on the Berkeley campus. The rich players are determined randomly by coin toss, the game rigged so they cannot lose. And yet, says Pitt, despite their presumably liberal men going in,
When we asked them afterwards, how much do you feel like you deserved to win the game? The rich people felt entitled. They felt like they deserved to win the game. And that's a really incredible insight into what the mind does to make sense of the advantages of the game.
so even though a subject like myself is just play acting,
You consistently find that I begin to attribute success to myself, even though it's a coin flip that got me on this side of the board. You, like a real rich person, start to attribute success to your own individual skills and talents, and you become less attuned to all of the other things that contributed to you being in the position you're in.
How's the American dream achieved? Pip is part of a team headed by Dr. Keltner that studies the psychological effects of both absolute and relative poverty and wealth.
Do people believe in this dream?
What they're studying is economic inequality, which, as our viewers probably know, is as high as it's been in almost a century in this country.
There are new data coming out on a daily basis from top laboratories showing no matter how you look at it, the effects of inequality are pernicious on things like bullying on school playgrounds, the quality of your physical health, how you handle disease.
What's somewhat surprising, says Keltner, is that even the haves suffer.
One of the things that wealth money does is it comes with a set of values, and if you want a deeper ideology, one of them is generosity is for suckers, right? And it's greed is good. But it turns out there are a lot of new data that show if you're generous and charitable and altruistic, you'll live longer, you'll feel more fulfilled, you'll feel more expressive of who you are as a person, you probably will feel more control and freedom in your life.
Of course, there are plenty of wildly generous rich folks. Just look at the growing list of billionaires who've pledged to give the bulk of their fortunes to charity. And 6, I got a double again, but statistically speaking, there's a significant tendency to look out for number 1 if you're at the top.
What do I got? Oh, you gotta get out of jail free.
Oh, excellent. That's very nice. Although I could probably, given the fact that I'm a rich person, get bailed out. And as Piff observed when he ran this experiment with hundreds of doggedly friendly Berkeley types, those in the role of top dogs began to bark like this. So I give you $200, you get $200. Well, give me $140 because I'm going to find that right. Okay, done. Now listen to the way that you just spoke to me. It's very directive, almost like a demand. But we found consistently with people who were the rich players that they actually started to become, in their behavior, as if they were like rich people in real life. They were more likely to eat from a bowl of pretzels that he positioned off to the side. They ate with their mouths full, so they were a little ruder in their behavior to the other person. While I was thanking God no pretzels were present, Piff continued. Those arbitrarily assigned the role of low dog became more nearly man's best friend.
If I take someone who's rich and make them feel psychologically a little less well off, they become way more generous, way more charitable, way more likely to offer help to another person.
So when people are playing this Monopoly game and they're in the poor person role that you're playing, they, if they were rich in real life, become more understanding, more compassionate.
Not just in this game of Monopoly, but in a whole bunch of other experiments that we've run where we make rich people feel poor or poor people feel rich. We find the same kinds of businesses.
Differences that could conceivably help people understand their subconscious biases and perhaps even moderate the costly effects of economic inequality. But until that happens, we suggest you look both ways before crossing.
Again, like a fascinating idea, right? Like when you feel rich, you just tend to treat people a little bit worse. And again, this isn't a Democrat issue or Republican issue. This is one of those things where if you have power and influence, you don't tend to notice the experiences of people who are in much more different or difficult situations than you. That is part of the problem of meritocracy. So I'm going to play this video because I think it does a decent job talking about meritocracy, but I'm going to show you about what meritocracy is and kind of a little bit more about how it
Politicians from
works.
all walks of life nowadays agree on one thing. We need to build more meritocratic societies. That is, societies where everyone, no matter what their background is, has the chance to succeed on their own merits. This is a beautiful idea, responsible for some great things, like free education for all, positive discrimination, and a real effort to end nepotism in business and government. We've largely done away with the old world of feudalism, where lords couldn't manage their estates, commanders couldn't understand the principles of battle, and peasants were brighter than their masters. No longer is background an impassable obstacle to advancement. An element of justice has finally entered into the distribution of rewards. It's been going on for about 250 years, ever since Napoleon declared that the ranks of the French army and civil service would henceforth be open to all on merit rather than family background. It's been a brilliant development, but there is, importantly, a darker side to the idea of meritocracy. Because if we truly believe that we've created, or could one day create, a world where the successful truly merited all their success, it necessarily follows that we'd have to argue that the failures were exclusively responsible for their failure. In a meritocratic age, an element of justice enters into the distribution of wealth and status, of course, but also of poverty. Low status comes to seem not just regrettable, but also deserved. Succeeding financially without inheritance or contacts in an economic meritocracy gives individuals an element of personal validation that the nobleman of old, who'd been given his money and his castle by his father, had never been able to feel. But at the same time, financial failure has become associated with a sense of shame that the peasant of old, denied all chances in life, had also thankfully been spared. The question of why, if one is in any way good, clever, or able, one is still poor, becomes infinitely more acute and painful for the unsuccessful to have to answer to themselves and other people in a new meritocratic age. There's turned out to be no shortage of people willing to answer the question on behalf of the poor. For a certain constituency, it's clear, and perhaps even scientifically provable, that the poor owe their position to their own stupidity and degeneracy. With the rise of an economic meritocracy, in certain quarters, the poor have moved from being described as unfortunate, target of the charity and guilt of the paternally minded rich, to being described as failures, fair targets of contempt in the eyes of robust, self-made individuals who are disinclined to feel shamed about their mansions or shed crocodile tears for those whose company they've escaped. In the harsher climate of opinion that can gestate in the fertile corners of meritocratic societies, it's become possible to argue that the social hierarchy rigorously reflects the qualities of the members on every rung of the ladder, and so that conditions already in place for good people to succeed and the dummies to flounder, attenuating the need for charity, welfare, redistributive measures, or simple compassion. It's a symptom of our great faith in meritocracy that it's largely become impossible to explain away our failures as the result of bad luck. While it's granted that luck maintains a theoretical role in shaping the course of our careers, the evaluation of people proceeds in practical terms as if they could all fairly be held responsible for what happens to them. It would seem duly and even suspiciously modest to ascribe a victory to good luck, and more importantly, it would be pitiable to blame defeat just on bad luck. Winners make their own luck. That's what modern society tells us. It's tough living in a world so in love with the idea that we're all responsible for everything that it's largely dismissed bad luck as a credible explanation for defeat. But, of course, there can never be a truly meritocratic system, because the merit of an individual is far too complex and subtle a thing to be determined by what job you end up having and how much money you end up earning. Those who have faith in meritocracy are essentially subscribing to an insane and certainly arrogant assumption that ordinary humans, employers or customers, can handily take over the solemn responsibilities that past ages more wisely left in the hands of a god who, helped along by the angels, was due to weigh the souls of each person on the day of judgment. No one in this world ever gets exactly what they deserve, in terms both of the good things and the bad things. Life is to a large extent, we don't quite admit to, random, in a way that the meritocratic philosophy denies. To free ourselves from some of the more punishing side effects of a meritocratic worldview, it would be wise to cease investing something as haphazardly distributed as jobs and money with moral connotations. We should retain a little of the old-fashioned, modest belief in a distinction between what someone earns and what they're like as humans.
So again, that tells you a little bit more about meritocracy and kind of how meritocracy works. Really, it's the idea that if you have a good experience of life or a bad experience of life, you really deserve it. And like if you're rich, you deserved it, and if you're poor, you deserved it, right? And so getting a sense of that, what that is and how it works is really important if we're going to understand how we create stories around these narratives, right? So when someone's rich or a CEO, we say that they earned it, right? But somehow we say, because they earned it because they worked hard, right? When you think about a landscaper who works a 14-hour day, like they are not rich, they're still kind of more poor, but we say they didn't work hard enough, right? So meritocracy is the idea that if you were successful, you worked hard and you deserved it, but it doesn't notice that other people work hard and still never reach the same heights as other people. And that is the issue that we have to take on. So when we're looking at the story of meritocracy, like we have to understand what the implications of hearing this story over and over again do to us, as well as what does it do to others to further separate rich and poor people, or people are seeing people as deserving their fates or not deserving their fates?
Is it better to be born rich with below average intelligence, or poor with above average intelligence? If we lived in a society that actually upheld the values of meritocracy and equality of opportunity, the answer would be clear. You would choose the natural gifts, because they would give you the best chance to succeed. But we all know that equality of opportunity and meritocracy are largely mythologies. And while it makes people uncomfortable to admit this, 2 recent studies from the United States demonstrate that the children of the wealthy, even low achievers, have better life outcomes than the high achievers from low-income backgrounds. Asking why this is the case serves as the goal of this video, but the answer isn't that the children of the poor have genetic or cultural weaknesses that make them less likely to succeed. Rather, the reality is that the children of the rich have greater access to tools which allow for them to mask their weaknesses and highlight their strengths in a way poor children do not. These manifest in the earliest years of education, but the gap grows ever wider as students move into high school, university, and beyond. First, a study covered last fall by the Washington Post made it clear that while there was no real sense that the children of the rich were more gifted than their poor counterparts, they still saw wide gaps in academic and monetary achievement. And as noted on the onset, when you compare the brightest poor kids with the least bright rich kids, the latter graduate from post-secondary education at higher rates. Put another way, among the bright children of poor families, less than a quarter will graduate from college. But whereas this study was largely focused on how genetic similarities between poor and rich children still manifest in great inequalities later in life, more comprehensive is a recent Georgetown University study focused on the American education system itself. Their executive summary paints a bleak picture. Despite the widespread belief that the USA is a society where your effort and brilliance determine your success, they find that the K-12 career pipeline reveals a sorting of America's most talented youth by affluence, not merit. Their data further suggests, in line with the study cited in the Washington Post, that while rich students with below-average grades in kindergarten have a 70% chance of being successful in life, the same can only be said for 30% of high-scoring kindergartners from poor families. But more than kindergarten, the study shows that the gap grows by the early teenage years. Rich students who have high scores in the
Sorry, folks.
Is it better to poor families? But more than kindergarten, the study shows that the gap grows by the early teenage years. Rich students who have high scores in the start of elementary school are extremely likely to stay there, whereas half of early high-achieving poor students will fall back in relation to the general pack. And by 10th grade, just a short while before many start post-secondary schooling, high-scoring poor children are far less likely than high-scoring rich children to have a degree 10 years later, and less likely than even poor-achieving rich people. And even beyond education, the ultimate outcome of one's socioeconomic status in adulthood is determined more by your parentage than your brilliance and achievement. Here, Georgetown compared bottom-scoring rich people with top-scoring poor people, and found that by 25, 71% of those rich people remained above average in their socioeconomic status, while 69% of those poor people remained below average. This video clip by Georgetown offers a good example of why this all happens.
If you're born wealthy and have high test scores in kindergarten, you're likely to have high scores in high school and be ready for college. But if you're born smart and poor, your chances are slimmer. Half of poor students with high test scores have fallen behind by 8th grade, compared to 1 in 10 rich students with high scores. Consider 2 kindergartners, one with wealthy parents and low test scores, and one with poor parents and high test scores. Before and during elementary school, one child has access to resources that the other does not. These patterns continue in high school, setting the stage for adult success. The highest performing poor students have less chance of graduating from college than the poorest performing rich students. A student from a poor family who has high test scores in 10th grade has a 4 in 10 chance of graduating from college within 10 years. But a student from an affluent family who has low test scores in 10th grade has nearly a 5 in 10 chance of getting a college degree.
So there you have it. We're comparing smart children to one another from across income backgrounds. The rich often capitalize on their brilliance, while the poor do not. But really striking at the core of meritocracy and equal opportunity is that high achievement loses out to better connections. This comes in the things the video mentions, like better educational resources and extracurricular activities. but it also manifests in professional networks that make finding and keeping success much easier. So what solutions do they offer? Simply put, Georgetown looks to fixes within the education system to ensure that poor students are given more constant support from early childhood onward, and that they are given a greater sense of their options and possibilities in terms of career and educational opportunities after high school. But while all that seems fine and dandy, I don't think it's going to solve the underlying issue, which is massive inequality and the ability to manifest that inequality across generations. This isn't simply about more help being given to poor students, because that fails to recognize that there's an element of class conflict here. People want their kids to succeed and will do what they can to ensure it. Thus, you need to find areas in which well-off parents help their kids outside school and find ways of offering those same things to poorer families. This could be publicly funded extracurricular activities, less discrepancy between schools in terms of resources by funding them on models not so wedded to the average wealth in the immediate community, and of course, free education at the post-secondary level, funded by taxation increases on the wealthy. Along this line, more should be done to implement taxation that limits the ability to pass on large amounts of wealth, which only serve to perpetuate inequality, and the state of affairs where rich people win either way. This includes not only higher income taxes, but also wealth, estate, and capital gains taxes. Studies like this have gone relatively underreported in the media. Maybe it's because they make affluent and well-connected people uncomfortable with the knowledge that their success, or the success of their children, isn't really merit-based, and that the poor folks in their community, even the most gifted poor folks, don't have all that much opportunity in comparison. But these sorts of studies are vital because they urge us to collectively ask and answer a question. If we really want a meritocratic society where everyone has equal opportunity, what do we have to do to achieve it? Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I would appreciate if you like, comment, and subscribe.
So with that, think for yourself, right? Who works hard? Or who do we say works hard? And then think about it. Who's rich and who deserves to be rich? And then think again, right, with these two people, a hedge fund manager or a landscaper. Who really works harder? And then think about, how do the stories that we hear really justify winners and losers in regards to social class? Well, a lot of it happens because we learn through an idea called socialization. Movies, TV shows, people around us, they all show us kind of how things work. Sometimes we are not explained the rules of things, but over time and through over-observation, we start to see the trends, we start to see the tendencies. And through a series of punishments and rewards, we learn how to act and what to do in order to exist and live within a system. So, for example, no one taught you how to ride in an elevator, right? But when you go in an elevator, what direction do you face? The front, right? Nobody taught you this, but you just saw this. What would happen if you got on an elevator and faced the wrong direction? Well, you'd probably get looked at, you'd probably get stared, or people would kind of like move away from you, right? What happens if you eat on an elevator, like if you just sat down and you ate on the ground? Or what if you attempted to have deep philosophical conversations on an elevator? You would learn that people wouldn't be amenable to that because you are going against what they were socialized to do and think with elevators and elevator rides, right? This is another example of how we learn to be and do things with socialization. So how does the system works? Well, there is an assumed set of values. We have a glorified sense of success based on those values. We have a strengthened sense of who belongs and who does not belong. We tend to defer power to whoever the in-group is. And those that are left out create a counterculture. And so with counterculture, this is like someone that is like, okay, I know I'm not rich. I know I'm not middle class. So they kind of create their own culture and their own sense of belonging with their out-group folks to create a sense of in-group and a rejecting of the values that have rejected them. So with this, we have to see the system of socialization as a cycle. We have beginning things that happen. We get socialized. we get reinforced, and then we get the results, right? So over time, we get a sense of who belongs and who doesn't, based on the connections, right? And all these systems of socialization happen in a lot of different ways, right? Like as a kid in school, if you couldn't afford the fancy brands and stuff like that, you might have got made fun of. Or like if you had to get the free lunch, right? Maybe you got made fun of because you were too poor, right? If you were one of the poor kids, perhaps you weren't able to play sports because you weren't able to fork over the money to be able to afford to do sports, right? And then as an institutional level, you can see that school districts spend more money on high achieving students than the ones that they do on as opposed to ones that are special needs, right? We put a lot more money into the folks that are high achievers, honors, AB, all that stuff, than we do the kids that are special needs or seem to have emotional issues, right? And then systemically, we start to see that the folks that are overvalued or they spend more of the money on tend to be more successful in society. But when you think about it, it's not fair because they got more of the resources, right? So with this, we want to start to understand how systems work with our communication. When we're poor at an individual level, we might have been left out of experiences with friends, so maybe you couldn't afford to go to the movies. At a group level, maybe you were kept out of a group because of expensive sports, right? Like you can't afford to play hockey or you can't afford to play golf. So we tend to see a lot fewer black and brown people in these sports and more of them in sports with equipment with less equipment, like football or baseball or basketball or softball. If you think about those, only 2 of those sports just require a ball at all to play, whereas hockey's got ice time and things like that that cost a lot, that can leave certain people out. And then lastly, being poor at an institutional level might keep you from attending different colleges and universities because you have to take the SAT or the ACT tests, because you have to pay for college application fees, which can be hundreds of dollars for each institution you try to go for. Or it could be higher tuition rates for out-of-state schools. Or at another level, there's private universities that always charge more than public universities do. And then lastly, being poor at a systemic level keeps you poor because, as you saw in the video, being poor has more costs and it can make it much more difficult to get ahead. So with this, I want you to deeply think about and consider, like, who works for stuff? Who earns stuff? And who do we tell horrible stories about, right? It's funny because we'll hear about welfare, right? People on welfare. And we'll hear people damning people on welfare. But we don't look at the fact that as a government, we subsidize gas in the United States to make gas cheaper for everybody to buy. But in addition to making it cheaper for everybody to buy, it also pads the wealth and the earnings for companies like Exxon or BP because we give them corporate welfare. We give them some money to help keep their, it kind of like pads their prices. So they can afford to sell more stuff because we wouldn't, like, if we had to pay the true cost, like say gas was $7 a gallon. Well, we're not going to just be driving around willy-nilly if gas is $7 a gallon, right? But because the government helps to pay to keep their price low, we buy more. And because we buy more, they have higher profits, right? That's an idea called corporate welfare. And we want to become aware of these things. Where does this stuff come from? Where do we learn or hear or understand these messages? And why is it that those that are considered rich get so many more benefits than those that are considered poor? And we really want to start to challenge those stories that we hear of socialization. Like, did the rich guy really earn it? Or did we help support the rich guy by buying their goods, right? We tend to think that this person worked really hard and then they earned all their money, rather than telling the story of how we all supported them on their rise to the top and how maybe because we helped support them on their rise to the top, they might want to pay more taxes because we were part of the people that helped to make them so successful, right? You see how it's a slight changing of how we communicate and tell the story that gives us a sense of difference. It helps us become more aware of who's being overvalued and who's being undervalued based on the stories we tell or the ways we talk about certain things. So with that, that's all I have for you today. I hope you're well. Peace and blessings to you. And then I think the next assignment is watching People Like Us about social class. Who belongs and who doesn't, and why they connect or why they don't. Have a great day, and I can't wait to hear from you in your assignments.